Look at the Chicago skyline today, and you'll see a symphony of steel and glass, a testament to the heights of human ambition. It is a city of shimmering skyscrapers and billionaire legacies. But beneath the asphalt and the tourist-friendly parks lies a city built on a geological insult. Before it was the second city, it was a cursed patch of earth that shouldn't have existed at all. Imagine the stench. Long before the scent of industrial smoke or lake breezes, there was the Shikaakwa. In the tongue of the indigenous Potawatomi, it wasn't a name of pride, it was a warning. It meant the place of the wild onion, or more literally, the place of the skunk. The air wasn't fresh. It was a thick, suffocating soup of swamp gas, rotting vegetation, and the damp rot of a land that refused to drain. In 1833, Chicago wasn't a town. It was a geographic nightmare. It was a low-lying, waterlogged depression where the prairie met the lake, a place where the water didn't flow, it just sat and festered. This was a landscape defined by the mud. Not just wet dirt, but a hungry, black slurry that locals claimed had no bottom. Legend says travelers would find hats floating on the surface of the streets, only to discover a man and a horse still attached to them, buried feet deep in the muck. It was a place of stagnant pools and a bone-shaking, feverish misery that soaked into the soul of everyone foolish enough to stay. Yet, in this single year, 1833, a collective madness took hold. While the ground itself was sinking, the value of it was skyrocketing. A fever transformed this festering swamp into the epicenter of American greed. They didn't see the mud, they saw the map. They saw a future crossroads of a continent, and they were willing to spill blood, betray ancient treaties, and build on a liquid foundation to make it real. This is the dark anatomy of the Midwest's greatest titan. And to understand how it rose from the muck, we have to look at the very moment the rules of the frontier were rewritten in blood and ink. How did a wasteland become a jackpot? The answer is buried in the shadows of 1833. To find the heart of this geographic disaster, you had to follow the stench to the forks. This was Wolf Point, the place where the north and south branches of the Chicago River collided into a single, sluggish artery of filth. If the rest of Chicago was a grave of mud, Wolf Point was its pulse. It was the frontier's version of Las Vegas, a chaotic social hub where the only things cheaper than the whiskey were the promises made in the dark. The name itself felt like a warning. Some settlers claimed it was named after Mowaway, a local Potawatomi chief whose name translated to the wolf. Others believed the origin was far more literal, a place where actual timber wolves gathered at night to howl at the flickering candlelight of human intrusion. In 1833, the skyline of Wolf Point consisted of a few sagging log structures, most notably the Sauganash Hotel, a building that would become the epicenter of the town's early soul. The Sauganash was owned by Marc Beaubien, a legendary raconteur and fiddler who acted as the self-appointed conductor of Chicago's early madness. Inside those thin wooden walls, the air was a suffocating haze of wood smoke, wet wool, and the sharp tang of cheap rye whiskey. Accommodations were a joke. Men slept spoon-fashion on the floor, dozens to a room, lucky to have a dry plank of timber to call their own. While Beaubien's fiddle screeched out frantic folk tunes to keep the spirits high, the real wolves were just yards away in the tall prairie grass, their eyes glowing like embers in the twilight. This was a bizarre, claustrophobic theater of survival, where the rules of the civilized East simply didn't apply. Rugged fur traders, weary soldiers from Fort Dearborn, and sharp-dressed speculators from New York all shared the same tin cups and the same desperate dreams. They weren't just here to drink, they were here to gamble on the impossible. But as the music played on and the laughter grew louder, a massive, silent shadow began to loom over the forks. A gathering was forming that the fiddle couldn't drown out. 8,000 souls were arriving to witness Chicago's most brutal act of expansion. The music was about to stop, and the real cost of this land was about to be tallied in blood and betrayal. If Wolf Point was the town's pulse, the Treaty of September 1833 was its original sin. Picture this: over 8,000 indigenous people, Potawatomi, Odawa, and Chippewa, converging on this muddy, chaotic outpost. For miles, the prairie was dotted with wigwams, and the air was thick with the scent of campfire smoke and a far more sinister ingredient, government-sanctioned whiskey. This wasn't a diplomatic summit, it was a whiskey-soaked liquidation. The federal commissioners knew that the quickest way to empty a land was to first hollow out its people. They didn't come with just pens and parchment, they came with barrels. Reports from the time describe a scene of orchestrated chaos. Warriors once proud and defiant, now stumbling through the knee-deep muck, lured into a fog of intoxication to sign away everything their ancestors had protected for centuries. On September 26th, under a large open-air tent, the Great Council reached its horrific climax. In exchange for 5 million acres of prime Midwestern territory, land that would soon become the engine of the American empire, the tribes were given hollow promises, meager annuities, and an order of eviction. They were told they had 3 years to vanish, 3 years to pack their lives into carts and head toward the sunset, across the Mississippi, into the harsh, unknown plains of Kansas. Every signature on that parchment was a nail in the coffin of the frontier as they knew it. Speculators watched from the sidelines, leaning against the bars of Wolf Point, already mentally subdividing the soil before the ink was even dry. They called it manifest destiny. The Potawatomi called it the end of the world. It was a cold-blooded transfer of wealth disguised as a legal contract. The white father in Washington had spoken, and his voice sounded like the clinking of gold coins and the gurgling of cheap spirits. But as the last of the tribes began their slow, agonizing march toward what history would later record as the Trail of Death, the men who stayed behind realized they had a new problem. They had the land, yes, they had the legal right to build. But how do you construct a titan on a foundation that is perpetually trying to return to the water? The tribes were gone, but the mud remained, and it was about to spark a different kind of madness. By the end of 1833, Chicago had ceased to be a place and had become a fever. The physical reality of the swamp was being paved over by a different kind of landscape, a paper map. While the Potawatomi were being marched away, the ground they left behind was being chopped into rectangles and sold as if it were solid gold. This was America's first great Western property bubble, a speculative frenzy that defied every law of common sense and geological reality. Speculators from New York and Boston, men who wouldn't know a muskrat from a mink, were pouring their life savings into what were known as water lots. Imagine paying top dollar for a piece of the Chicago shoreline that was literally 3 feet deep in lake water or black muck. To the locals, it was a joke. To the investors, it was the jackpot. One contemporary visitor, unimpressed by the sagging log cabins and the clouds of infectious mosquitoes, described the prices as crazy. Tiny plots were selling for hundreds of dollars, a fortune in an era where a common laborer's daily wage was less than $1. The air in the taverns at Wolf Point wasn't just thick with whiskey, it was heavy with the stench of pure greed. People were buying and selling titles to streets that didn't exist, to buildings that hadn't been framed, on land that was essentially a liquid. It was a giant game of musical chairs played on a foundation of grease and silt. Land values weren't based on what the soil could grow, but on how fast you could flip the deed to the next sucker arriving on the lake steamer. But here was the catch. You can't inhabit a map. You can't live in a ledger. The hundreds of new arrivals needed more than a deed. They needed a roof over their heads. And in a town where the ground was too soft to support heavy stone, and the timber was miles away across the prairie, the traditional rules of construction were about to be shattered. A revolutionary, fragile invention was about to turn this liquid wasteland into a wooden fortress, overnight. While the speculators were trading paper dreams in whiskey-soaked bars, a man named Augustine Taylor was standing in the mud with a hammer and a radical, some said suicidal, idea. Up chojen nam mot nagin tam tramba moi ba. Building a house was an act of slow, heavy labor. It required massive oak beams and hand-carved mortise and tenon joints that took months to master and weeks to assemble. But Chicago didn't have months, and more importantly, it didn't have solid ground to support that kind of weight. Taylor looked at the thin, cheap pine boards arriving from the north and the new, mass-produced factory nails, and he saw a way to cheat time. On the corner of Lake and State Streets, he began erecting St. Mary's Church using a method that looked more like a bird cage than a building. Traditional carpenters stopped in the mud to mock him. They called it balloon construction, a term of pure derision. They laughed, claiming the first stiff wind from Lake Michigan would carry the building away like a child's toy. They called it fragile, skeletal, and a reckless insult to the craft. But the joke was on them. This balloon frame was the ultimate hack for a town in a hurry. It was light enough to sit on the shifting silt of the swamp without sinking into the abyss. It required no master craftsman. Just two men with hammers could raise a house in 24 hours. Suddenly, Chicago wasn't just growing, it was erupting. Thousands of these wooden skeletons began to populate the prairie, turning a collection of cabins into a sprawling grid of pine and nails. It was the birth of the American suburbs, but it came with a lethal trade-off. By using long, uninterrupted wooden studs from foundation to roof, Taylor had unknowingly created a chimney effect. Every single house was now a perfectly designed combustion chamber. Chicago was building itself into the largest, densest tinderbox on Earth. They were trading long-term safety for short-term profit, constructing a city of matchsticks and waiting for a single spark to turn the dream into an apocalypse. But as the wooden city rose, the settlers realized their liquid foundation held a much darker secret than just instability. The very water they were building upon was becoming a biological weapon. To the modern eye, the Chicago River is a centerpiece of architectural tours and holiday celebrations. But in 1833, it was a biological weapon. It was a slow-moving, charcoal-colored soup of human waste, offal from the first rudimentary slaughterhouses and the rotting carcasses of livestock that had lost their battle with the mud. Because the land was so impossibly flat, barely a few feet above the lake level, the river didn't really flow. It just sat and festered, exhaling a thick, humid miasma that the settlers called canal fever. Every time a heavy rain washed over the prairie, this concentrated slurry of filth was pushed out into Lake Michigan. This was the city's only source of drinking water. It was a lethal, circular trap. The city dumped its sins into the river carried them to the lake, and the people pumped that same liquid back into their kitchens. This was the era of the Great Unwash, where a single glass of water could be a death sentence. Cholera and typhoid weren't just distant threats. They were the invisible residents of every wooden tenement rising in the incorporation year. The river was the literal dumping ground for everything the city didn't want to see: the blood of the fur trade and the refuse of the new arrivals. It was a liquid graveyard, a trench of ink-black silt that held the city's secrets deep in its bed. The stench was so pervasive it became part of Chicago's soul. Visitors remarked that you could smell the town miles before you saw its sagging cabins. Yet, the developers of 1833 were undeterred by the smell of death. They didn't see a public health catastrophe. They saw a plumbing problem. It was here, in the midst of this toxic stagnation, that the most arrogant engineering feat in human history began to take form. They weren't just going to clean the river. They were going to play God and force the very water to run backward, deep into the heart of the continent. But before they could defy the laws of nature, they had to establish a law of men. They needed a government to legitimize the madness, and that led to an election that was more of a conspiracy than a democratic act. On August 10, 1833, the town of Chicago was officially born. In the history books, this is recorded as a triumph of civic organization. But if you look at the primary source archives, the reality feels less like a democratic awakening and more like a closed-door conspiracy. To incorporate a town under Illinois law, you needed a population of at least 150 people. The boosters claimed they had it, but on the day that decided the fate of the Midwest, only a handful of men actually showed up to cast a ballot. Depending on which old, mud-stained ledger you believe, between 13 and 28 men gathered to vote. That's it. A tiny cabal of speculators, saloon keepers, and fur traders, men with names like Owen, Kimberly, and Dole, decided that this patch of sinking mud should have the legal power to govern itself. They weren't interested in the will of the people. They were interested in the power to tax, the power to issue bonds, and most importantly, the power to validate the shaky land deeds they were clutching in their whiskey-trembling hands. This wasn't an election. It was a corporate takeover. By incorporating, these men created a legal entity that could borrow money to build the infrastructure they desperately needed to save their investments. They needed bridges to reach the North Side and docks to attract more New York capital. The board of trustees they elected at the Sauganash Hotel wasn't a council of elders. It was a board of directors for a real estate scheme. The incorporation gave the town a name and a seal, but it didn't change the fact that they were living in a biohazard. With the power to make laws now firmly in their hands, the new leaders of Chicago faced a terrifying reality. The population was exploding, but the waste had nowhere to go. Their newly minted town was sitting on a ticking clock of disease. And the newspaper they founded that same year, the Chicago Democrat, was about to become the loudest voice in a campaign to hide the growing pile of bodies behind a wall of propaganda. But even the best propaganda couldn't mask the smell of the river. On November 26, 1833, a man named John Calhoun pulled the lever on a hand press at the corner of Clark and South Water Streets, and Chicago's first newspaper, the Chicago Democrat, was born. To the world outside the swamp, this was the moment Chicago gained a voice. But to those living in the knee-deep muck, the paper wasn't just a news source. It was a weapon of mass deception. Calhoun, a practical printer from New York, arrived in a town that was essentially a biohazard and immediately began painting it as a Mediterranean paradise. The Chicago Democrat was the ultimate booster engine. Its pages were filled with glowing prose about unparalleled growth, golden opportunities, and a manifest destiny that made the sinking jam lay sound like the next Rome. While Calhoun's ink was drying on stories of a booming metropolis, the reality was that people were still sleeping on tavern floors and dying of the ague in windowless shacks. This was the birth of Chicago's culture of the hustle. The newspaper served as a beacon to lure more immigrants and more East Coast capital into the speculative bubble. It was a curated reality designed to mask the stench of the river and the instability of the ground. Calhoun understood a fundamental truth that would define Chicago for centuries. If you print a lie often enough, and with enough conviction, the world will eventually pay you to make it true. But as the Chicago Democrat successfully drew thousands of new souls to the lakefront, a massive human divide began to crack open. Behind the glowing headlines and the wealthy speculators, a silent, invisible army was forming in the shadows of Fort Dearborn. They were the ones who would actually dig the ditches and haul the timber, yet their stories were never printed in Calhoun's columns. They were the disposable fuel for Chicago's fire, and their world was about to become the darkest corner of the incorporation year. Who were the people the Chicago Democrat refused to mention? The answer lies in the mud of the canal trenches. If the Sauganash Hotel was the city's drunken heart, Fort Dearborn was its decaying brain. By 1833, the fort, once the proud shield of the American frontier, had become a cobweb castle. The military discipline that once kept the chaos of the wilderness at bay was rotting under the weight of civilian greed. Soldiers, bored and poorly paid, frequently slipped over the walls to join the gambling and drinking at Wolf Point. The uniform was losing its meaning in a town where a common clerk could make a year's salary in a single afternoon by flipping a land deed. But the real shadows didn't fall from the fort's towers. They rose from the trenches being dug in the mud just beyond them. This was the year the first great army of labor arrived. The Irish, lured by the promise of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, a project that would finally link the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, thousands of desperate men descended on Chicago. They didn't find the golden city promised by Calhoun's newspaper. They found a death trap. These laborers lived in a world the speculators refused to acknowledge. While the wealthy argued over water lots, the Irish were huddled in shanty towns, made of scrap timber and mud. They lived in the low-lying hollows where the stagnant water never dried, breathing in the miasma of rotting prairie grass. They were the ones who faced the cholera outbreaks and the typhoid fevers without doctors or hope. In the eyes of the Board of Trustees, these men were as disposable as the nails used in tailors' balloon frames. They were the muscle that would break the earth, only to be buried within it. The city was rising, but it was being fueled by a human sacrifice that left the ground around Fort Dearborn stained with more than just river silt. As 1833 drew to a close, Chicago was no longer a dream or a settlement. It had become a monster, devouring lives to feed its growth. As we look back at 1833, a chilling pattern emerges. Chicago was not built on the sturdy foundations of an American dream, but on the wreckage of a biological nightmare. It was born from the betrayal of the Potawatomi, the exploited labor of Irish immigrants, and a speculative mania that turned toxic mud into gold. The skyscrapers you see today are not just engineering marvels. They are monuments to the cold indifference of the powerful who decided certain lives were disposable. This city didn't just conquer the swamp, it consumed it. Every tower stands on a foundation of mud and blood. Some things are worth remembering, especially the things they wanted you to forget. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe and tell us which dark city to solve next. I am Chronicles of Time, and history is always darker than you think. Goodbye.